Death at Daisy's Folly, Chapter 13. There is always more misery among the lower classes than there is humanity in those of the higher. Victor Hugo, Le Misérables. Royal pennant fluttering, the prince's entourage made steady progress along the narrow track toward the market town of Chelmsford. The day was warm for November, the sky a brilliant blue, and Charles sat back, willing himself to enjoy the ride. The beeches had lost almost all their golden leaves, and their limbs were stark against the sky. But the oaks still kept their bronze-brown foliage, and the hedges and banks were bright with the warm gold of nut leaves and bracken, the red of creeper and bramble. Noisy flocks of starlings, sparrows, and finches scoured across the stubbled fields and along the hedges. Redwings and fieldfares foraged for seeds of cow, parsnip, and dock. While the Daimler generally outpaced the other two vehicles, it was seldom out of view for long. The motor car would disappear for a time, then they would overtake it, sitting along the verge while its pilot attended to some necessary lubrication or demonstrated some point about the operation of the automobile or indicated some scenic view to his two passengers. The prince, who had seemed at best resigned to the excursion, now appeared to take it as a holiday, waving to workers in the field and saluting those they passed who appeared surprised and not a little frightened by the motor car and the noise of the clouds of dust that attended right behind it. Charles thought that the parade must make an odd impression on its witnesses, and he wondered if they realized it was led by their future king. He also wondered if Bradford was making any headway in persuading the monarch to take a more liberal view of motoring in general. As the entourage approached the outskirts of Chelmsford, it began to take on a carnival air. The vehicles were joined by a ragtag gang of boys rolling iron hoops and racing alongside with gleeful shouts, then by a baker's boy in knickers riding an old-fashioned high-wheeled bicycle with packets of fresh-baked bread lashed onto his back. Charles heard more shouting and turned to see a brewer's dray falling into line behind the wagon, trailed by 3 or 4 barking dogs and an aproned girl with a flock of raccoons of white geese. It looked like a gypsy troupe had come to town. Daisy turned to peer over her shoulder. "What we need," she remarked wryly, "is a brass band marching in front." "No," Charles replied. "What we need marching in front is a man with a red flag." He was right. As they approached a dusty intersection, a uniformed constable suddenly pedaled up on a safety bicycle, skidded to a stop, and raised his white-gloved hand. "Halt!" he cried, "in the name of the crown." "Oh dear," Daisy said. The constable pulled a black book from his pocket, opened it, and began to read as loudly and as rapidly as he could, given that he was afflicted by a violent stutter. It is my duty to advise you that you have violated the first two sections of the Locomotive Act of 1865, to wit, Section 1, persons exceeding the speed limit of 2 miles per hour are in violation of this act. He paused in his recitation and wiped his mouth with the back of his white-gloved hand and went on. Section 2 of persons failing to post a man bearing a red flag 200 yards in front of a moving vehicle are in violation of this act. He lowered the book. Inasmuch as you are in violation of 2 sections of the aforesaid act, it is my duty to arrest you in the name of Her Majesty the... He stopped and tried again. In the name of Her Majesty the... Bradford sounded his electric bell. Startled, the constable looked up. His gaze alighted upon the royal pennant. His mouth fell open, and he gave the unmistakable outline of the stout passenger in the passenger seat. "Your Highness?" he asked faintly. The prince pulled off his goggles. "Good show, old chap," he chortled, leaned over and punched Kirkesmith's arm. "I've never been arrested before." Somebody shouted, "3 cheers for his Royal Highness!" And the assembled crowd, which now included a ruddy-cheeked fishmonger with a wooden tray suspended from his neck, and a group of pinafore-clad school children with their slates, began to huzzah. Hats flew in the air, boys whistled, girls clapped, dogs barked, and geese honked. The fishmonger and the brewer's drayman broke into a chorus of he's a jolly good fellow. Charles couldn't help feeling enormously relieved. One never knew these days whether the people would respond to royalty with respect or with resentment. If an anarchist had been in the crowd, the welcome could have turned nasty indeed. Daisy was chewing on her lip. "I do hope Bertie does not resent the familiarity," she said nervously. "He seemed to be enjoying himself," Charles observed. He did indeed. The prince had disembarked from the Daimler and was standing beside it, ready to receive the constable. That nervous gentleman pulled off his hat and approached the royal presence with obvious trepidation. "Good morning, constable," the prince said genially. "Morning, your highness, sir," the constable managed. Thrusting his hat under his arm, he came to rigid attention, his face as red as a brick, and finally saluted. "At ease," the prince said. "Now, what was it you wanted, constable?" The constable could barely even manage the words. "It seems, your highness—" He was suddenly seized by a fit of coughing. "By your leave, your royal highness—" He cleared his throat mightily and tried again. "I fear I must point out, sir—" He faltered once more. "You must point out that his highness's motor car is breaking the law." The prince tactfully finished the constable's sentence, since the constable seemed unable to do so. The constable had gone quite pale in the meantime. "Yes, sir," he whispered wretchedly. "And we can't have that, now can we?" the prince said with great humour. "It wouldn't do at all, would it?" "No, sir," the constable biting his lip. "Well then," the prince said affably, "what we need is a red flag." He turned and spotted the fishmonger, who was wearing a dirty red bandana tied around his neck. "My good man, what will you take for your neckerchief?" "A shilling, sir," the fishmonger replied, whipping it off and handing it through the crowd to the prince. "Done," said the prince, and tossed the fishmonger a coin as the crowd cheered and others clamoured to trade the neckwear for a royal coin. Holding the filthy neckerchief delicately by one corner, he turned to the constable. "We shall also require a man to lead us. Would you be so kind, constable?" Thus presented with an ingenious resolution of the difficulty, the constable gave an audible sigh of relief. "Oh, yes, sir," he cried. He looped the handkerchief around the handlebar of his bicycle. "Where are we going, if I may ask, sir?" "To the workhouse," the prince exclaimed, and climbed back into the Daimler. "To the workhouse?" the amazed constable stammered as the assembly applauded and whistled. "Let us be off," the prince cried and flung up his arm. In a moment the parade was moving again, led by the dazed constable on his bicycle, flying the fishmonger's dirty neckerchief as if it was his highness's very own pennant. Afterward, Charles had occasion to ponder on the ironic contrast between the light-hearted prologue of their comedic journey and the tragic despair of the bleak place at which they will soon arrive. The workhouse was surrounded by a neighbourhood that belonged in one of those circles of Dante's Inferno, and Charles would not have been surprised to see over one of the doors a sign that read, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." A filthier, more wretched collection of buildings and alleys he had never seen. The sun had disappeared behind a bank of dark grey clouds, and the air was heavy with fetid odours. The cobbled streets, so narrow that he could almost reach out and touch the dingy buildings on either side, was lined with the ragged children who gaped at the royal parade as if it conveyed beings from a distant country. And perhaps it did, Charles reflected, contrasting the splendour of the estate that they had left to the dirty doorways and foul gutters. He wondered what the prince made of the scene. Was he moved by the misery of his poor subjects, or was he so thoroughly cocooned in royal cotton wool that he could neither see nor hear nor even smell it? Ahead of them the Daimler slowed, and Kirkesmith jumped out and began to walk alongside, watching the bystanders warily. Charles wondered if he were carrying a pistol. "Perhaps this expedition wasn't such a good idea," Daisy said, glancing nervously at a pair of ill-looking fellows lounging against the rubble heap. "Bertie is often offended by unpleasant sights and smells. Perhaps you had better tell Bradford to remain with the motor car and prepare to leave at a moment's notice." Charles nodded. Given the neighbourhood, he felt certain that Bradford needed no encouragement to remain with the motor car. Is that the workhouse? He asked, glancing ahead, and Daisy nodded, tight-lipped. Built of red brick stained with 50 years of black soot, the workhouse stood atop a small rise at the end of the street, which led up to it and stopped at its door. A welcoming party was assembled at the top of the 3 front steps, upon which a tattered and stained red carpet had been laid, borrowed, as its conspicuous gold insignia indicated, from the office of Chelmsford's Lord Mayor. Indeed, the mayor himself, a cheerful, smooth-cheeked individual wearing a red velvet cap and a matching ermine-trimmed cape, had come to receive the prince, along with 2 more sombre men in black frock coats and a small round lady in black silk with an old-fashioned lace cap perched on her fuzzy grey curls. The entourage came to a stop. Kirk Smythe helped the prince alight, while Charles handed Daisy out of the brougham. The mayor doffed his large red hat and bowed low, and there followed a good deal of bowing and curtsying as Lady Warwick, who was already acquainted with the welcoming committee, introduced the prince, the mayor, Warden Holden, Matron Kingsley, and Guardian Brocklehurst, the latter a member of the Workhouse Board of Guardians. Each of these persons in turn expressed his or her humble gratitude for His Royal Highness's concern and her ladyship's compassion, and hoped that the visit would not prove too trying. While this was going on, Charles retrieved his camera, mounted it on a stout wooden tripod, and got down to the business of documenting the prince's visit. He was hunched under the black shroud, planning his first photograph, when Guardian Brocklehurst, a burly man with sandy whiskers and hairless brows, came toward him. "You there, stop," he growled. "No one has been authorized to take photographs." He had his hand on the camera and about to wrench it away when Kirk Smythe intervened. "This is the royal photographer," he said sternly. The prince turned around. "I say," he called out, "is there a problem?" Warden Holden stepped forward. "If it please your highness." He extended a soft white hand that would have done justice to an undertaker. "The Board of Guardians had ruled that photographers are not allowed within our doors. We've had several unfortunate experiences with—" "That is to say, sir," Matron Kingsley put in, "there are those who would portray a good work here in an unfavourable light." Her grey curls bobbed earnestly. "Our funds are woefully inadequate, sir. We cannot do all we might wish to assist these poor souls under our—" "Well then," the prince said briskly, "I should think that photographs of these woeful inadequacies should be used to wring the hearts and purses of the rich." He smiled. "I promise you, matron, that my personal photographer will capture as many unfortunate scenes as possible." Guardian Brocklehurst continued to glare at the camera, and Warden Holden bit his lip nervously. But at Charles's request, the party stood for a photograph on the front steps. The prince in the middle with Daisy on one side and the mayor on the other, the remaining 3 behind them. Then, leaving Bradford and Lawrence and the 2 coachmen to guard the vehicles, they went around the building to the back where there was a walled-in recreation ground. In the middle there were 3 long wooden benches on which were seated 40 or so well-scrubbed and tractable inmates wearing what looked to be freshly ironed clothing. The men on one bench, the women on the other, the children on the third. "And what have we here?" asked the prince, striding in front of the benches, swinging his silver-headed walking stick as if he were reviewing the guards. "Taking the air, sir," Warden Holden said. "They take the air several times a day, sir," Matron Kingsley added. She turned to Sir Charles. "This would make a good photograph." Charles set down his tripod, thinking that the scene was so obviously staged that it was hardly worth wasting photographic plate on it. But there was a sad pathos on the scrubbed faces that pulled at his heart. Daisy was frowning. "When I visited here unannounced," she said, "the inmates were not so clean as this, and there were 3 or 4 times as many." "Today is Bath Day," explained Matron Kingsley. "I believe that you were here on the day before Bath Day, your ladyship." Daisy's dark blue eyes narrowed. "And how many souls do you care for in this place?" The mayor spoke up proudly. 137 last night, your ladyship. More every day as the weather turns chill. Winters is always the worst, of course. That's when casuals all try to crowd in, whether they need charity or not." "That's right," said Guardian Brocklehurst. He looked down his long nose. "Why, last night when the men applying for shelter were searched, one had a whole shilling. He claimed he was saving it for his family, but with that kind of money, he could have paid for a bed at an inn. You searched him, Daisy asked. Do you search all the men and women who seek shelter from you? Warden Holden folded his soft white hands. Beg pardon, your ladyship, but our aim is to confiscate pipes, tobacco, and matches, which are not allowed. Each inmate may keep fourpence. The prince was looking impatient. Where are we off to next? He demanded. Matron Kingsley had developed a nervous tic at the corner of her mouth. We thought, sir, that a view of our recreation ground would suffice. But there are no more than 40 persons on these benches, Daisy objected, which leaves nearly 100 unaccounted for, and I particularly wanted His Highness to visit your brickworks. The mayor stepped forward. I must suggest to your ladyship, he interjected, that the sight of too much wretchedness would tire the royal eyes. I humbly entreat. Damn it, the prince says pettishly. I have ridden 13 miles in a rattletrap motor car with the express intention of seeing the unspeakable inmates of your wretched workhouse. Now I mean to see them, all of them, whether the sight tires the royal eyes or not. He aimed his walking stick at the mayor. Do you take my point, sir? Yes, your highness, gabbled the mayor. Well then, his highness said grimly, let's get on with the miserable business. He tucked his stick under his arm. Come along, your ladyship, you two Kirksmythe. Bring the camera, Sheridan. And so it was that Charles, pausing ever so often to photograph a scene, followed the prince and Daisy as they surveyed the dismal interior of the Chelmsford workhouse, Kirksmythe at their heels. They walked hurriedly through the men's, women's, and children's wards and the nursery, where miserable half-clothed inhabitants huddled in unclean corners and on filthy beds. Picking up their pace, they quickly toured the kitchen, where a gang of ragged, dirty women was stewing up small quantities of mutton with large quantities of cabbage and potatoes in huge copper kettles on massive stoves, while others made coarse flour into bread. To Daisy's inquiry, the matron reported that the luncheon menu was the same each day. 3 ounces of meat, 6 of cabbage, 6 of potatoes, and 4 of bread. With 4 of bread and a pint of broth for supper, she added hastily, and 4 of bread and a pint of porridge for breakfast. So you see that they're adequately fed. The prince shuddered. Charles wondered whether he was comparing the meagre meal to the enormous breakfast he had put away this morning: parchment pie, devilled kidneys, eggs, bacon, bread, several kinds of fruit. But he only said, I cannot abide the odour of cooked cabbage, and left the room. From the kitchen they went across the recreation ground again, the benches still filled with the sad-faced occupants, to a large barn-like structure at the rear. Inside, several dozen men, women, and children were labouring in dusty dimness. The children were chopping straw and carrying it up to a puck mill turned by a trio of men, while women broke up chunks of clay and mixed it in the mill with buckets of water. Other women were filling moulds with the stiff paste that came out of the mill. Men knocked the bricks out of the moulds and stacked them to cure, while other men carried the cured bricks to the outdoor kiln that reared like the flames of Hades in the yard behind. The ragged clothes and the weary faces of the labourers were covered by a powdery dusting of clay particles, so that they looked like walking ghosts, and except for the roaring of the kiln and the squeaking of the puck mill, not a single human voice was raised. It was a scene of such sombre melancholy as Charles had never seen before. In the unnatural quiet, he set up his camera, hoping that his photographs would capture the speechless despair on the workers' faces. Our brickworks, your highness, the warden said, nervously glancing at the camera. Capital idea, exclaimed the prince, looking around, apparently seeing, for the first time, something to admire. You are to be congratulated upon the industry of your workers. I imagine your bricks fetch a pretty price. Quite so, Guardian Brocklehurst replied, as the warden seemed to relax. We supply the local market and ship by railway as far as Colchester. It's a modestly profitable operation. Charles, enshrouded within his black hood, thought that the man was understating the situation. Brickmaking on this scale, with no rent, low-cost supplies, and free labour, it was a recipe for downright enormous profits. Brickmaking is an ideal occupation for our inmates, sir, Warden Holden explains, gathering courage from His Highness's approval. It requires limited skill, except for making the forms and laying the courses for firing. 2 trained craftsmen supervise that work. And as you see, the matron put in helpfully, a task may be found for all. Even small children can be set to work preparing the straw and grinding the clay. With such ready labor supply, the brickworks operates the whole day round, 2 shifts. That meant that the women and children were working 12-hour shifts, Charles thought sadly. No wonder they looked so worn and weary. His sadness turned to anger as he thought of the irony of the situation. Under the Factory Act that had passed almost 2 decades before, children under 10 could not be employed in a mill or a mine, and children under 18 had to be given a Saturday half-holiday. But the managers of a workhouse, which was not regulated under the law, could employ children with impunity and pocket the profit of their labor. "With half of your inmates always at work," Daisy said, "you require only enough beds for the other half. Is that not so?" "Exactly," Matron Kingsley replied triumphantly. "It is a great economy." "You see, Lady Warwick," the prince asked, smiling, "things are managed so that the workhouse is supported by the labour of the very people who depend upon its services. A tidy solution, by Jove, I like it." Charles shook his head. It was a sentiment to which even the staunchest conservative could have agreed. If Daisy had brought H.R.H. here in hopes of turning him towards socialism, it looked like that was a lost battle. But Daisy was undismayed. Without hesitation, she launched her counterattack. "And how much do you pay your workers, Warden?" she inquired icily. Warden Holden's eyebrows shot up. "Inmates of a workhouse are not paid wages, as your ladyship knows very well." His voice was huffy. "The labour of their beds and board, according to the provisions of the Poor Law Act of—" Daisy did not allow him to finish. "You require these men, women, and children to work at this back-breaking labour without wages?" She turned to the prince, imploring. "Don't you see, your highness, these wretched people are no better off than slaves." The mayor pulled himself up. "Oh, no, your ladyship!" he cried in horror. Lady Warwick whirled on him. "Your inmates are slaves. You pay no salary, so your bricks can be sold for far more than they cost to produce. And to judge from the appalling conditions we saw today, only a fraction of these people's earnings go to provide for their food and shelter. What happens to the rest?" Guardian Brocklehurst cleared his throat nervously. "I assure you, your ladyship, the Board of Guardians follows the most stringent accounting practices in apportioning its funds." The prince frowned. "I'm not sure I follow your argument, my dear Lady Warwick. The inmates are free to leave if they wish, are they not? No one confines them here, ergo they are not slaves." "But where are they to go?" Daisy asked passionately. "They have come here because they could not find work, so where are they to turn?" She threw a dark glance at Guardian Brocklehurst. Of course, if the workhouse were not in the business of brickmaking, some local brickmaker might employ them. Or if they were paid a fair wage for their labour here, they might be able to afford housing and food for themselves. But as it is, they are condemned to— Ahem! The prince coughed delicately. "This is all quite interesting, Lady Warwick, but I fear that my throat is growing raspy from all the dust in the air, and the time for luncheon is rapidly approaching. We must let these good people get on with their work." Daisy's face registered disappointment and a sharp dismay. "But Bertie," she said, "I hope that—" She didn't get to finish the sentence. She was interrupted by a dour-faced woman who opened the door and stepped inside. The woman was followed, to Charles' great surprise, by the lanky young man who had been sent to fetch the doctor yesterday. Tom, his name was. He whipped off his cap and bowed to the prince, then turned to Lady Warwick. "Lord Warwick wants that your ladyship and his highness come back to Easton quick as you can, ma'am. There's been a misadventure." "Another accident," the prince frowned. "We haven't even untangled the last one yet. Who's been hurt?" "It's Lord Wallace, sir," Tom said. He shifted his feet uncomfortably. "He's dead, sir." "Dead?" Lady Warwick asked. She had grown suddenly very white. "Was it a shooting accident? Did he take a fall? How—" Tom twisted his cap in his hands. "No, ma'am. He was murdered, ma'am. Sure he was. Right in the middle of his forehead." With a little moan, the countess sank to the ground.